So for you, Jeff, I know you were dealing with shame and all of that. Were you in that level of distress or hyper alert? I mean, was the relationship issues causing that much stress for you?
Yeah, not the same type. Not the same type of sympathetic nervous system, catecholamine, epinephrine, overload. But it was constant angst and stress.
And what
Yeah.
did that do physically to you?
So it created a lot of sleepless nights and a lot of anxiety. But there's nothing I could do about it. And so it also created some, purpose and resolve to just lean on God and do what I could do. Take the next right step, one step at a time.
Did it also create any kind of just mental dissonance? I want to do X, but I keep living and experiencing Y, and that I don't know, maybe at some point it's almost a hopeless feeling of this. How does one get out of I want to do X? I feel like I'm stuck in Y, and I'm in a malaise of sorts until there is some, what was that part of what was going on?
Yeah, there were definitely times I felt that sort of kind of hopeless frustration. Yeah.
So the separation provided some of that space for stress and anxiety and all of that to kind of settle for you, Mary, to allow your central nervous system to kind of settle down and stop the cortisol spikes, because that can, a lot of the women interviewed for my research had autoimmune,
Hmm.
just adrenal fatigue or chronic
Hmm.
fatigue, or um, getting new allergies that they never had
Hmm.
before. And so
That
all
happened
these
to
things
me.
happen. So for you, it was not just, come on, Mary, get some resilience. Why can't you just do this under the same roof? You're just being a little bit difficult by insisting that we live in two separate spaces. For you,
Hmm.
it really was having physical impact on you, the amount of stress and things being unresolved and the lack of safety that you felt.
Hmm. Yeah, I gained 40 pounds. Then I was skin and bones. I was, on medication for depression, anxiety. It wasn't really helping. And it was just this crazy cycle, that it was constant. Like he would do okay, and then I would be lulled into like this sense of security, and then the bottom dropped out, and so then it was just up and down. And but I will say that second separation is when he really, and that was about a year ago. Was it a year? A little bit over a year ago, like, because it started in May.
Maybe two. It
No, it
was
started
through
in May.
January.
Yeah. So it started, yeah. And so um that's when he really started doing the work, like in earnest, and really started walking the walk instead of just talking the talk. And that has done more for me as far as those symptoms than any pill, than any um uh therapist, even though I've gone through lots and lots of therapy. Just having the realization that this person is really trying to be trustworthy. It's not perfect every day. Like, there's different struggles, but I am in such a better place because I feel like I know who I'm living with. I know that we're on the same page. And yeah, that has made a huge difference. So my physical symptoms are gone. I don't have that underlying sense of panic constantly, like I always felt like I was on the verge of just shattering into a million pieces. If somebody like said boo, I felt like I would just, my head would blow off. And that's not the way it is. And so that translates into me being, more present with my kids, more present in the work that I do, more present as a wife. And so, and I think, we have to all do our own work. However, him doing his work has impacted me in really positive ways.
Jeff, between the two of them, what's the difference you had mentally between separation one and separation two?
Um, really hard to compare. One was mostly in another country. Second wasn't. For the end of the second one, I was living literally on the other side of a wall from a family. So it's really hard to compare.
I think he means like mentally.
Yeah, it's hard for me to remember what might have been different. But one thing I did want to say is that I think people say time heals all wounds, and I think there's a degree of truth to that. Stephanie's shaking her head no.
Yeah,
No,
that's what you're
that is
doing in
not
that time.
true. Yes.
Yeah,
Time does not heal if the work's not being done.
but if there's someone who's, pushing back against the separation, it's almost like an accelerator because, it was going to take time and building trust and consistency, no matter what. But when Mary was in that sort of nervous system overload, like she described, that was going to take a longer period than a separation where she could really get that nervous system rest and be able to relax. And so I think it's like an investment. I guess I thought of it as like an investment, and try to see it that way as opposed to a step backwards away from what we wanted. More of an investment in moving forward.
He says that now, but for both of the separations, he did not see it that way. This is like on the other side of that. And the second separation was really serious. Like I was talking to divorce attorneys for the second separation. Like we had that wasn't a therapeutic. That was, you have betrayed me again. I don't think I can do this again. I don't know if we're ever going to come back together again. And so we had, like two different households, and I got my own bank account, and like was making plans to move on with my life. And so I think that's what really kind of prompted him to really buckle down. Like he knew I was serious.
I had a question. I wanted to go along that line. So, Jeff, sometimes some of the men I work with, when we're talking about separation, they get angry and defensive. And then it's like, she's punishing me. This is just retaliation. Like she's out to get me. There can be some paranoia that's in there. This is just about divorce. Did you wrestle with any of that at the first separation?
Yeah, it definitely felt like a step in the wrong direction. Definitely felt like a move toward divorce, and it felt risky. And yeah, I was not at all fond of it either time in that respect. So it is more in retrospect that that I see the benefits, and yeah, but there are pros too. It was a time to kind of mature a little bit, to make more intentional and deliberate relationships with our kids, to not lean on Mary in really any way in terms of day to day, food and laundry and anything like that. So it's it's a good time to mature and living with her in that state of nervous system was difficult because as she described, everything felt so threatening to her that any little argument was a huge deal. And so, in a way, it was, while stressful and fearful, moment to moment, I could also kind of relax a little bit. I didn't feel like I was, going to set her off all the time.
And the
So
second time we did, like, there was no relationship talk. There was no like marriage talk. Like, it was all about like, because I was like, if we're going to get divorced, we need to learn how to co-parent the kids. And that was like my focus. Like, and so there was really no like, okay, we're going to come back together. Like, because, and we didn't tell the kids that. We told the kids like, we're separated and we don't know what's going to happen. And so it was a whole different mindset for me. And I think that Jeff could see that too. Like, this was not about a relationship. This was about me picking up the pieces of my life and figuring out how to go forward.
I guess to both of you, Jeff, you hinted at the last point you made that you learn to be more individual. Especially in the second one, speak more, and this really is for both of you. Speak more about just how growing and ironically learning to be more me instead of us actually turned into more us.
Yeah, I think Mary mentioned alexithymia and I mentioned how therapy was a big part of the recovery. And so before, I didn't really have the ability to identify my emotions apart from feeling anxious and uncomfortable. So any negative emotion was just kind of anxious and uncomfortable. And so I kind of have learned over time to identify much earlier what I'm feeling, and that helps me to get to why. And so now there's more degrees of emotion, more different types of emotion, anger or happy or joy or particular types of stress. And so that was really helpful. And got what I was going to say next about your question. What was the question again?
So how did growing more about how did learning and maturing more just individually?
Yeah. And another thing I wanted to say was that my feelings were very much dependent on Mary's feelings. And so some of that happens in marriage, like if mom ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. But I was completely dependent really on how she felt. If she was okay, I was okay. If she was happy with me, I wasn't okay. And so part of therapy and recovery and group actually was taking a step back from how she feels and not being as affected by how she feels. And so learning to just be patient and let her feel what she feels and know that it'll come around and be there in a less defensive fashion and not always feel like it's all about me when she's unhappy with me. So that was an aspect of recovery that was a little strange, to be less affected by how she's feeling.
Yeah, so for me and what I've seen it being trained in a more traditional marriage therapy, Jeff, when you said that felt like a step back to me, well, that's what we would have said in traditional marriage therapy. Keep the couple together at all time. Don't even work with them individually. It's always the marriage. It's always the relationship. Keep them together. Never let them separate. Stay in the same bedroom. more dates, more sex, more this, more that. And that's the very worst thing you can
Oh
do
my gosh.
when you need space. And so maybe some listeners are saying, well, Stephanie, this doesn't really apply because they're really talking about, porn and sex addiction. But I want to say, for many neurotypical spouses that I've worked with, even if there isn't addiction, if there's chronic stress, chronic conflict, chronic isolation, a person is apparently like running the house and has over mental load. There's the constant things we're always arguing about that never get resolved, or we never argue because we never talk. All of those things, with or without addiction, have the same central nervous system cortisol. It's about cortisol and stress, whatever that is. And we know that neurodiverse couples experience more of that kind of stress because it's a later in life diagnosis. We don't know this thing we're dealing with, and we're calling it this. We're assuming intentions. We don't have conflict resolution skills. And that, even without an addiction, can cause all the same symptoms that Mary was talking about, which is where most women get to when they need to have some kind of therapeutic separation because they've got to let their central nervous system calm down. They got to let their brain stop flooding with all of that stuff.
And before, I'll say this too, Stephanie, we were separated in home before I ever knew anything about his addiction because of all the things that you just named. So I had got to the point before I ever knew he was addicted to anything that all of that constant conflict, feeling lonely, isolated, always feeling like I never knew like when he was going to have a meltdown or what was going on in his brain, and just that isolation. And we had been to therapist after therapist after therapist that told us more date nights, more sex, more blah, 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 all of that. And so I just shrunk into myself because I felt like it was me. Nobody was listening to me. And yeah, so even outside of addiction, I was still experiencing all of those things in marriage, and needed the in-home separation even before the out-of-home separation because of that.
So, Mary, in the two separations, what in those did you learn about you? We've talked about how it healed, right? The lack of stress, let your body rest, but just from who you are and what compare you now to you 3 years ago. What is there? What does that growth pattern look like? Because we see Jeff's growth is probably a little bit more obvious, but there's some in you as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say that I thought that it was the marriage or nothing. At the thought of discovery, and that when I realized that I wasn't married to who I thought I was married to, and that the marriage I thought I had was never going to be, like I fell apart, like to put it mildly. And that first therapeutic separation, I don't really think I had enough time to really understand me and understand what I wanted and what I needed. It was really damage control. And I was so still wanting to repair the marriage, even though I told myself that maybe I wasn't, that I rushed it and I didn't allow myself the time that I needed. And so when we came back together after that, it was still two really unhealthy people, like in a marriage that, I mean, we had the realization, or I had the realization that, he was an addict and autistic, and we needed to do some things differently. But I think if I would have let the first one run its course like it should have, that there may not have been the need for the second one. Now, he made the choices that he made, and I'm not making excuses for that. But I think if I would have allowed myself more time to heal and more time to be who I am now, which is like a more confident person. I'm more sure of my intuition, that when I feel something, I'm not just crazy. I'm not just overreacting, that there's something to it, and that I can live on my own. I can take care of myself. I can take care of the kids. And that I don't need, like he said, he needed to be okay for me to be okay. Like that was 10 times worse for me because I was constantly afraid of him melting down on me, on the kids. And so I was constantly doing damage control for him in every aspect of our life, with his family, with my family, extended, within our home, at church. Like I was constantly micromanaging everything to make sure he was in a bubble to where he wouldn't melt down and then dissociate from the family. And I didn't realize that until, therapy and the separation. And so now I'm super okay with whether, for the most part, whether he's okay or not. And I'm better able to help him by suggesting, not managing. I'm better able to help him regulate himself. But if he's not regulated, it doesn't affect me in the way that it used to.
All very good, which is why I'm into groups and self-work and your own identity and your Christ identity outside of marriage, who I am in Christ for each person.
Yeah.
So that I'm not okay. My okayness doesn't depend on the other person's okay.
Yeah.
All right, we don't have very few minutes left, but I want to toss a discussion over to Dan and Jeff, because Mary and I decided we would get too dysregulated if we entered into this discussion.
Yes.
We had a lot of positive feedback about the first time you were on. We also had people asking questions, but then we had a little bit of some haters and some negative feedback that I'm going to let Jeff and Dan talk about. So this was some of it. This discussion, part one, was disrespectful to Jeff. It was meant to humiliate Jeff. It's emasculating to Jeff. Men must have respect, even if what they're doing isn't worthy of respect. Mary should have submitted to Jeff, who didn't want the separation, and she should have respected him, even though he was doing things. Accountability is disrespectful. Boundaries or ultimatums that suggest someone to get help is disrespectful. So, guys,
Take it away.
toss that right over to you two.
Yeah, I certainly don't think boundaries and accountability are disrespectful. I think that those are necessary. Accountability is absolutely necessary, and everyone in every role, I think, should have accountability. And I think that that transparency, vulnerability, accountability is necessary for healing. So that I feel sure about. Boundaries, I think, are meant to protect, not to harm another person, but just to protect, whether it's you or your family, or good fences make good neighbors, and boundaries, I think, are just about safety. So I feel pretty sure that I disagree with those two aspects. And of course, there's different opinions about what respect and submission look like. But to me, this is more of an issue of safety, more an issue of promoting safety than being about submission and respect.
So I've already forgotten most of what you just read.
Of course.
But if you think about it from let's go back to Genesis, and they were both one. There is, I'll say all, and somebody might find a loophole. I can't think of any system, and if you think of marriage as a system, where the component parts, you can allow one to be defective and it not affect the whole. And that idea.
We already get hate mail. Go ahead.
That idea of submission and this idea is backwards.
Mhm.
That is thinking the wrong way about the whole thing. If I don't need some, if I'm not if you're not submitting to me, or I'm threatened by um, accountability, then I'm thinking about I am the system, not I'm a part of one. And I don't see that's I don't see that modeled scripturally anywhere as it where it comes to relationships. So I'm struggling with just the why the question is actually important at all, because it's not a valid scriptural question. Because the whole nature of the relationship is purely giving. That's what, I mean, you go through all the way through First Corinthians. I mean, that's just what you do is you give. I lay down my right to be all of me and accept that I can do anything I want to do,
Mhm.
because I accept that there's someone else in the family, and there's, again, I'll say all, you probably could find a loophole in this one, something I do that doesn't have a impact of some regard to someone else,
Mhm.
at least of any kind of real consequence, right? Um, the way I think, what I dwell on, has an effect eventually on how I act, how I say, how I live, what I do, what I spend my money on. So you can't even really get away with thinking wrong and say
Mhm.
that it is going to be, I'm going to do it in a silo, I'm going to do it in my own little vacuum, and it's not going to affect. And because of that, as long as I am affecting someone else, I don't believe you can get away with the idea that I am not accountable. I am not respecting. That I don't see how that works in a relationship, uh, when someone isn't allowed to say, "Hey, you're hurting me."
Mhm.
It doesn't compute. So uh, I accept that the person asked the question, and I'm struggling with why the I'm struggling with how to make that question have a legitimate answer and not negate the question outright.
I don't think that you can have respect and submission without trust. And you can have obedience or feigned respect and submission, but I don't think you can have real respect and submission without trust. And so that's kind of what I was talking about with getting there a little quicker, a trust accelerator that maybe over time that could happen together, but I think it was a little bit more efficient, a little quicker to have that separation as well. And so that's what I would answer those people as. Without trust, you're not going to really have respect or submission. And so the question then to me is the best way to rebuild trust. And if the separation, therapeutic separation, is a necessary component of rebuilding that, then it's worth it.
And the goal, to me, I have to say something. The goal should not be submission. Like so when you submit, which I don't even really like that word very much, and I wonder what it really translated to from the Greek when Paul wrote those words. Women don't have trouble coming up under the leadership of a godly man who is trustworthy, who is looking at marriage like a biblical marriage, like loving a woman as Christ loved the church. Like no woman is going to balk at coming up under or alongside a man like that. And I think if someone is trying to figure out how to get their wife to submit to them, that there is an inherent problem in that, because submission is a voluntary act. It's not like an MMA fight
And
where somebody is somebody's submitting till you tap out. Like that's not what we're
That's not,
talking
you don't
about
submit to a
here.
tyrant.
Yeah, exactly. That's not what we're talking about here. And so I think
Mutual submission.
Yeah.
Requires trust.
Yeah. And I think maybe the person who asked that question should maybe go back and look at their motive for, and what type of an answer they were looking for and why. And I would say to the emasculating part, that the most masculine and sexy thing that I've ever seen Jeff do is his work in therapy and coming back and allowing the kids and I to benefit from that. Like that is the most manly thing I've ever in our 20 years seen him do.
I like that. I think that's a great note to end on. And I think too, the way Dan and I view submission and all of that stuff is that Paul talks about follow me as I follow Christ.
Mhm.
Whereas many churches have taught like blind submission. Like if he wants to spend all the money or gamble, you just gotta let him. I even had one email say, well, if she would just have done the porn with him and they agreed to do it, then it wouldn't have been a problem. So there's this kind of like, I'm the boss, do what I say. And if you do it with me, that wouldn't be a problem. It's like, well, methinks thou protest too much
Yeah.
as to why we want to hold on to this. But
Yeah.
you guys are great. End us, Mary, because you do coaching and you don't do marriage work, but you do have your own podcast and you do your own coaching. So will you just tell people some of the things that you do and how to find you?
So my website is drmarycoaches.com. And I coach mainly women who are in neurodiverse marriages. And I also am doing now some family coaching of people with children on the spectrum, or to help them to sort of make their family lives easier, make the transition from a diagnosis to living every day with someone on the spectrum easier. And for women that are in these neurodiverse marriages, I help them to find themselves again. That sounds cliche. Find who they are, set goals for the future that are not so involved in their marriages. And I really love doing it. So drmarycoaches.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, Dr. Mary Holden Jones. You can find me on Instagram, Dr. Mary Coaches as well. And yeah, if you want to do an inquiry, there is a section on my website to do that.
Well, thank y'all very much for being on the show. Dr. Mary also contributed to a chapter in Uniquely Us, which is coming out in March of 2025. And I thank you for that. If you didn't hear part one, Mary's a pediatrician. So there's a little bit more backing there to really helping you move from diagnosis to practical tips and living in a family situation of children who are on the spectrum. And she's been through it as a mother, and educational help and just kind of how to find your bearings and to move forward, get out of being stuck. So thank you both for being here. And as we end, which of the two do you remember as we close?
None.
Okay. So you're not alone on your journey, and there is hope for your future.
That's better than what I was going to say.
There you go. All right. Till next time.